This is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoy this Critical Thought, your daily discussion on game design. And be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and you can pitch future Critical Thought topics. Alright everybody, before we get started with today's Critical Thought, today was the first day that I posted a double video Niho, which is about 2 hours of content. It all covers the first mission, and I want to get your thoughts on what you think about this change. As I've been playing Niho, for those of you who've been watching the Twitch stream, I am certainly a lot farther than that now. But as time's going on, I think I'm spending less time per individual mission, which is really good. But when things do run long like this, what are your thoughts on making these extra videos per day, or having a little bit less if I get through things very quickly? Let me know in the comments below. But speaking about these kinds of action RPG games, today's topic is going to be a very simple one. We're going to be talking Bloodborne versus Dark Souls 3. This is based on today's post over on Game Wisdom, which you'll find linked below. And oh boy, this is going to be a good one. Before we begin, please keep in mind that when we're comparing these two games, this is certainly not a case of what game is worse. We're essentially comparing supercars at this level, so it's pretty much like rating like a 9.6 versus like a 9.56, something along those lines. And it's very interesting how these two games have been developed. From Software has certainly perfected their action slash, I won't even say RPG, but more of an action game with RPG elements to it over the years. And Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 currently represent the best out of the company. Bloodborne, of course, being their experiment with another game on the PlayStation, and Dark Souls 3 being supposedly the final game in the Souls series. And when I think about comparing them both, and going with the post that I put up, there are several areas that I think about when I'm trying to be analytical about what I love about the Soulsborne series. The first one is the general mechanics, the moment-to-moment gameplay, or what am I doing in this game. And both titles, even though they are cut from the same cloth, have some very subtle differences to them. Dark Souls, obviously with the whole Souls series behind it, is about giving the player a variety of options. You can go into different builds, different weapons, spells, etc. The integration of the Estus Flask, and I think is it called the Ashen Estus Flask? I'm sorry, it's been a few months since I played it, to control both health and mana recovery respectively, basically remove those elements from being frustrating. As long as you get back to a bonfire, you can easily recharge your flasks and get back into the swing of things. And Dark Souls 3, of course, is on the slower side compared to Bloodborne, which we'll talk about in the next minute. Now, when it comes to Dark Souls 3, I did enjoy the fact that you are given a wide berth in terms of what you want to play as. If you want to focus on range attacks with bows and such, you can do that. If you want to be speedier with a knife or heavier with a giant axe like I did, they are both valid options throughout the game. Now, when it comes to Bloodborne, please keep in mind the fact that Bloodborne was developed in between Dark Souls 2 and 3. Which means while it certainly had the foresight of improving on the Dark Souls 2 formula, it still came out before Dark Souls 3 in terms of what it did to iterate on the design. Bloodborne is a lot faster than the Souls series. You don't have a dedicated block button, and the game is all about dodging and performing stagger attacks with your gun. It's kind of funny by the fact that this is a game where your gun is essentially your defensive option in some cases. And Bloodborne, from a moment-to-moment standpoint, is a lot faster than Dark Souls. It feels closer to a pure action game than the Souls series because of that. It's also, there is less room for error in Bloodborne. Get caught by an attack and you can't just shrug off the damage. Chances are you're going to take heavy damage to death. With that said though, there are a few things about Bloodborne's general play that I didn't like. I didn't like the fact that you had to basically rely on buying your vials and your bullets. One of the things that I thought Dark Souls did really well was streamline the health and mana recovery and just tying it to bonfire usage. It also meant that you could basically play each run or each time you go into a level at your fullest. I need to worry about conserving Estus Flask charges or Ashen Estus Flask when I know that if I run out, I can head back to a bonfire at the cost of having to do it again. In Bloodborne, the early parts of the game can be very frustrating if you run out of vials and bullets. It means that when you lose a boss fight, you're kind of back. You kind of lose some progress compared to Dark Souls, where you are kind of free to, take it, and if you lose, you can go right back into it. And there were times where I had to grind vials and such, especially when we get later in when you're dealing with the Chalice Dungeon craziness. Now eventually, you will hit that point of stabilization where you are making more than enough vials, or I'm sorry, more than enough echoes to pay for everything. But it still presents, I think, an unnecessary wall in the early to mid game, and that's why I gave the nod to Souls for it. Now, the next category is weapon design, and this is the very interesting one. When we talk about weapons, the Souls series has really elevated this kind of hand-to-hand combat. Weapons have different feels to them. There's that heft of the weapon that we really don't see much from action games. And Dark Souls 3 relies on a very wide berth in terms of weapons. You have different classes, knives, swords, axes, staffs, etc. But there's multiple weapons per class. So it's not just one sword, you have multiple swords, and so on. And then different weapons have different feels to them, different damages, etc. Now the interesting thing about Dark Souls 3 is that they add in, I think it's called weapon arts, where each weapon and shield has a special secondary ability. Some shields let you do a parry, other shields let you actually make use of your weapon's special ability, and then things get even further when you throw in boss weapons, the ones you have to use the Demon Souls for. Bloodborne, on the other hand, goes for just complete uniqueness. There are no true classes in the game, but whatever weapon you use will kind of infer on what you can and can't do. And then you have the added benefit of the fact that all the weapons are called trick weapons, and they have a second functionality to it. So, like the basic weapon, the Hunter's Cleaver, for instance, you have this just weapon that's just a cleaver that you hack and slash with, and then it can open up to perform this giant, almost like a sword cleaver for wider swings and slower attacks. And then things get even crazier when you get further in. My favorite weapon was the Boom Hammer, which is just a giant hammer that you light on fire by smacking it against your shoulder. And this one for me, hands down, Bloodborne is better. I love this idea of these crazy combination of weapons, and the fact that it really lets you learn these weapons as opposed to just having 5 or 6 different axes, clubs, etc. I mean, they even have a freaking gunblade with that rapier shotgun or rifle combination that you get from Canehurst, and that to me just gives Bloodborne bonus points right there. Now, the next category that I think about is level and environment design, and they are separate. Environment design has to do with the aesthetics of the level, while level design has to do with the obstacles or the flow. When I think about environment design, I'm thinking about, again, like how this level looks and feels, and again, this is one of those topics where it doesn't matter what title we're talking about from the Soulsborne series, they're all amazing. And because of that, like I said, this is going to be like a 9.7 versus a 9.65. My nod is to Bloodborne, because I really love just this decaying, almost post-apocalyptic look that the game has. I was telling my friends that it feels like I'm in a horror game, and they say, yes, you were in a horror game. And anyone who's played through Bloodborne and has seen the whole story definitely knows that is the case. And areas like Old Yarnum, even just Central Yarnum, with how this place looks like, this is like 10 hours after the zombie apocalypse almost. Feel to it is just amazing, and it gets more and more disturbing as you get further in, when you get to areas like the Nightmares and the Old Hunters DLC. Now that doesn't mean, of course, Dark Souls 3 is any slouch. It does look impressive, but I really love how the history of the world is built into the environments, especially in Bloodborne. Now, I know you're probably wondering the fact that we haven't mentioned lore. And of course, we could have like 5 minutes and just completely break down the entire lore of Soulsborne, and we'll talk about Demon Souls. No, that's not happening here. Anyone who says they can explain the entire Soulsborne lore in 5 minutes is lying. That's not a critical thought. That's like a good 3-week college accredited course waiting for someone to do. And I know there are people who have made some really great videos on that out there. Now, getting back to the level design, this is where we can certainly have some debates. For me, my nod is to Dark Souls 3 in this regard. The reason is that I felt the level designs in terms of what they're, I guess, presenting to the player in form of challenge was more interesting in Dark Souls than it was in Bloodborne. Bloodborne has some really great levels, but it kind of felt that it started to bleed or blur together for a lot of the levels. And some areas were just so short that you really get a chance to see what was so special about it. The area at the lake, again, I am horrible with names, so please don't assume that if I forget the name of a character or something, that means it's less. It just means my memory is failing me on that. But with Dark Souls 3, there are some great areas in terms of presenting interesting and unique challenges. From the swamp areas to the catacombs with the giant skeleton boulders. The area, excuse me, that's the dark and mysterious version of the tutorial area where you fight Champion Gundyr is another good one. With Bloodborne, my favorite area, which I don't know if this is controversial or not, was the second nightmare, followed very, very closely by Cainhurst Castle. For me, some of my favorite areas of Soulsborne are those that are presented as just this enclosed, I guess, playground of death. I really enjoyed Sen's Fortress and the Painted World, stuff along those lines. And I liked how the second nightmare had this approach of you just pretty much starting from the outer cliffs and then working your way up this massive structure. And of course having 2 boss fights and the interesting enemies as well. Now, while Dark Souls 3 I think did have the better level designs, we now have to talk about enemy designs. And this is where things get another very interesting topic, and again, there sure is going to be a lot of debates for this. For me, it goes in terms of strictly on the enemy point of view, in terms of their design and how they challenge the player. I have to give the nod to Bloodborne. The eldritch, just like creepy factor of these enemies certainly won me over, and the game just pretty much hits like almost every kind of phobia in the book. You have giant balls of snakes, giant spiders, guys with like things growing out of them all over the place. The giant pig with like 8 eyes almost that you fight in the Central Nightmare. And then you have dogs with crows' heads and crows with dog heads. I mean, this is one of those games you don't want to play before you go to sleep. Now, the boss fights. This is the meaty part. I need to take a quick drink before we get into this. The boss fights are very interesting, and part of this discussion goes back again to the general gameplay of both series. For me, and I'm sure you guys are going to get ready to disagree with this, I think I would put Dark Souls 3 higher than Bloodborne in terms of the bosses. And the reason has to do with the options the player has and the consistency of the fights. When I think about Dark Souls 3, while there weren't like bosses I would consider, high up, all the way up here, there was just a consistent average of, great boss fights. I really enjoyed stuff like Champion Gundyr, let me see, the Unnamed King, the final boss fights. I really enjoy like these one-on-one battles that they had in it. And while there wasn't one boss I would say is, absolute amazing perfection at its finest, they were all just really great. I even enjoyed stuff like fighting the boss of the catacombs and the twist it was of dealing with the rings, the cathedral. Oh, speaking of which, here's another example of me completely forgetting things. I really enjoyed that whole cathedral section in Dark Souls 3. Again, that kind of you're scaling the cliffs of this massive building and trying to explore it. Now, the problem I have with Bloodborne is that it goes back again to the general utility of the player. Bloodborne was designed first and foremost around hand-to-hand combat. You do have some of those arcane items, but this is a game that's about using your main weapons, and that's pretty much it. If you don't learn how to combat enemies effectively, you're not going to get far. And because of that limitation on the player's abilities, it also creates a limitation on the enemy designs. It doesn't matter if your game has 800 different enemies if there's only 5 ways of fighting any given situation. And that's kind of what I ran into with Bloodborne. For a lot of the battles, they kind of felt the same. Simply because of the fact that it's just get around, attack. Get around, attack, stagger, attack, get around, and attack. Now, with that said, the highs of Bloodborne in terms of its boss fights were higher, in my opinion, than in Dark Souls 3. And, wrong thing, there you go. So while I did enjoy a lot of the bosses of Dark Souls 3, there were some standout fights in Bloodborne. Father Gascoigne, Gehrman over here, Ludwig, Lady Maria. Again, these battles that really pit you in a one-on-one situation were some of my favorites, and probably favorites out of the whole Soulsborne series. But there were a lot of fights that just got annoying. Especially the game's focus on large beasts, which, as we know, the camera of the Soulsborne series really isn't really that good with these large beast fights. Stuff like, what was it, the Cursed Pearl Beast, the giant blue lightning guy. That fight was more about fighting the camera. So was Amdala, I'm pretty sure I butchered that, the Cleric Beast, what was it, Lawrence the First, Lawrence the Cursed, or something along those lines. Whenever there were these giant fights, it felt that the camera was getting in the way more than fighting the enemy itself. And I think that's kind of, excuse me, just kind of choked on something. And that was kind of why I think Dark Souls 3 moved away for the most part from these giant battles. Most of the enemies were either the player size or maybe 1.5 times. There wasn't anything like the Tower Knight or Sen's Fortress's boss, or even something like Seth the... I completely forget his name as well from the first one. But the fights that did work for Bloodborne, again, were amazing, but in my mind, I think consistency is a little bit better, and that's why I have to give the nod to Dark Souls 3. And so with that said, I guess in terms of my calculations and all the points that I tallied up behind the scene, all those imaginary values, I would put Dark Souls 3 slightly above Bloodborne. But again, you have to keep in mind that Dark Souls 3 is the 3rd iteration of a series, while Bloodborne is number 1. And I'm sure if From Software ever gets around to making a Bloodborne 2, hopefully, that we'll have another debate there for sure. But I guess to end things on, what do you guys think? Which game did you like better in terms of its design? Again, we can certainly talk about the lore, but we'll be here for probably a few hours at that point. And for those of you watching, what did you think about the boss fights in Bloodborne versus Dark Souls 3? Again, for me, like I said, Bloodborne has higher highs, but I think it also has lower lows. While Dark Souls had more of a consistent, I guess, grouping in terms of where I would rate the bosses. And of course, as you know, I am currently playing Nioh, and when the time comes, maybe we'll do a Nioh versus Bloodborne versus Dark Souls 3 video. I'm sure that'll only be 2 minutes. Anyway, let's wrap it up here. Thank you so much for watching. If you're enjoying things, be sure to like and subscribe. If you have suggestions for any kind of content, critical thoughts, whatever, be sure to let me know below. Otherwise, I am Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. Be sure to check back daily for more great content. So, until next time, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and of course share with your friends. It always helps out. For daily posts on all manner of game design and industry topics, check out game-wisdom.com. To support the site and everything that I do, be sure to check out the Patreon campaign. If we can hit goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy, and I'll be able to support myself and my household. If you want to follow me, you can find me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day and random thoughts from me. And lastly, you can find me on Twitch right over there at GW Bycer for daily streams most nights around 10 Eastern. Thanks again for watching the video, and be sure to check out more great content coming to the Game Wisdom channel real soon.